Hey everyone, nice to meet you. So today I'll be presenting a presentation so that you all know uh, what motorcycles have to do with vulnerability management, what they have in common. Spoiler alert, it's all about risk context. And so I'm not just using this analogy just to have fun or make light of vulnerability management. It is really tough job. But I am using this analogy for two reasons. So one is entertainment value, but two is also helping security folks like yourselves create analogies like these to improve your ability to communicate with your non-security stakeholders, to help them understand security concepts without getting into the weeds and trying to explain to them and make them security experts. Um, just use what you've already got. All right, so a little bit about me. My name is Alex Babar. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Brinqa. Brinqa is a vulnerability risk management company, so we've been doing this for a little while. I am what I like to say is a 5 to 10-year-old in cybersecurity right now, but predominantly on the vendor side, right? So I have a different perspective than you all over on the practitioner side of the world, and a lot of respect for you all. But because I've been on the vendor side so long, I've gotten to chat with, analysts, the folks that are building the product, customers, advisors, all this sort of thing. And I've done that across both the product marketing role and also the product management role, and actually kind of building, security solutions. So, I have a healthy dose of market and customer feedback that kind of influences the stories that I tell. Sometimes you'll hear me say exact stories verbatim from conversations I've had previously. But I also span a few different disciplines. So identity and access management, application security, software supply chain security, and vulnerability risk management. I'm an Austin local. So if you are ever in Austin, want to chat, grab a virtual coffee, come reach out to me, give me a shout. All right, so does anyone actually know who this is? Yeah, so some of you know who this actually is. This is Steve Jobs. For those of you that don't know, this is a real photo to my knowledge. Anyway, and I ask you this question: Is what he's doing, is this risky? Okay, so a fair bit of you think that this is risky. Is it because he's not wearing a helmet? Okay. Is it because he's on a motorcycle? Just doesn't matter the rest. All right, so there's different reasons, but you all kind of think this is risky. And so tricked you, so this was a trick question. I think that's not the right question. It's not binary, right? Risk isn't that simple. So I ask you a different question this time. How risky is this? And, we're kind of, smart security folks, so we can quantify this a little bit. We'll say it's, a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most risky, 1 being the least risky. How risky is this? All right, let's say 1 to 5, kind of just comment if you think that sounds about right. Okay, so we have some 1 to 5s. What about like a 6 to 8 level of risk? High but not super crazy. Okay, we got some of those. What about 9 to 10? Yeah, okay. So I want to kind of pause there for a second, just kind of really stress a point. I just asked a bunch of you all how risky this is and to quantify it. And we clearly learned that risk is subjective and in the eye of the beholder to a certain extent, right? There is no, this is X amount of risky and that is the right answer. So we're kind of going to play off that concept as we go about today. But, I'm going to kind of take a step back and say that, what, I tricked you again. It's still not that simple, right? So what are we missing? We're missing context, right? So let's just say, if I kind of read from the comments, what the average risk actually is here. Let's just say this is a 7.5 risk, right? Let's call that our base risk score for this. But we're not done, right? That's just the start. So let me think. What if he wasn't going that fast? Does the speed that he's driving right now, does that change that 7.5 score? If it turns out he's actually stationary and all the blurring in the background is photoshopped, I can speak for myself. That absolutely lowers the risk score on this 7.5 down to a 1. He's just sitting on a bike, right? But what if he's going super fast? Right, he's going 100 miles an hour. Like, I mean, it maxes out to 7.5 to 10. I don't care about the base. It is a very risky activity. He has risky activity going fast, layered on top of that, right? So speed, that would be context that really matters. What about the bike itself, right? So, I mean, he's Steve Jobs. I could assume that, he takes care of his stuff. It's well maintained. Tires are properly inflated, that sort of thing. But at the same time, he is Steve Jobs. He's super, super busy. He's super busy. Maybe just wanted to get out of the office, had a bad call with Bill Gates and just needed a ride, tires hasn't ridden this bike in a while. Tires are underinflated. So that would absolutely change the risk, right? Depending kind of the health of the bike, how properly maintained it is, what kind of hygiene he's practicing and, keeping it a safe riding vehicle. So I think there's another big one here too. Any thoughts? So yeah, so I think the condition of the course, the road course itself, kind of looks like he's in an office park, right? He's riding around in an office park like this. I'd say, let's say closed course office park. To me, that would reduce risk, driving slowly throughout that. What if he's on city streets? What if he's going the wrong way on a street and publicly accessible road? Like, so the point is the environment absolutely matters. So much so that the base score is almost just an academic exercise, because really what matters is combining that base score of what we think with the context of what we know. All right, so I got one last one. So this is Steve Jobs. What if it wasn't Steve Jobs? Would that change anything? I think it absolutely would. What if you're a Microsoft fan? Maybe this is just not that risky to you. Maybe this is actually a good thing. What if this one of your children though, and not Steve Jobs? Like, would that, up the risk factor a little bit? Maybe, depends how much you like your children. But what if it's your favorite child, right? So absolutely, up that risk factor. So the point here, that I always want to make is we're talking about risk. We're not talking about technology or security right now. We'll bring this all together. But at the end of the day, context matters. So I got a new question for you. Is this vulnerability risky, this fictitious CVE from last year? The CVSS score says it is. It's a 9.0. How many of you think this is risky? Yeah, so no one wants to speed up. I'm almost certain that if I put this slide before the last one, before we saw everyone kind of, vote and talk about context and that sort of thing, that we would have had some, yes, this is a risky vulnerability. So this is the point I want to drive home. Risk absolutely is subjective. CVSS score is not taking the context of your business into account. And we've got to overlay these things to actually know if something's risky. And again, it's not a binary yes or no. It's we can quantify that a little bit. It's a little bit subjective. Is this risky to us? And even better, how risky is this vulnerability to us? And these aren't necessarily easy questions to answer at scale in reality, but conceptually, I think that's relatively easy for folks to understand. And that's my point here today. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about asset risk. We're going to talk about vulnerability risk. We're going to take a very short security meme break. And then we're going to talk about the timing of kind of when that risk occurs and when we want to address it kind of more proactively or more reactively. All right, so touched on this at the end of the Steve Jobs slide, right? So not every rider has the same risk profile. If we drop one level deeper, right, not every body part is as important as every other body part. So I actually put a lot of thought into this, and I was like, hey, let me just pause. How many of you have an unlimited security budget? No one, right? So yeah, like we know what we should be doing. I know what I should be wearing if I want to get on a motorcycle, but other stuff gets in the way. A big one is just not being able to financially afford the best security for all the things, right? So that's where prioritization starts to come in. So this is actually my prioritized list. It's like, okay, if this is all the stuff that I would need, what's most important to me? Helmet, absolutely number one. Would anyone prioritize anything else? Yeah, maybe a couple reactions, but not many. Okay. On the other side, absolutely my lowest priority on this list is the jacket. For a couple of reasons. One is everything else is a bigger priority, but two, I feel like there's some redundancies based on having something like a chest protector and elbow guards and gloves already on, right? So I just need the jacket less in this particular case. But a hard question is, which three pieces would you actually just give up? You can't have them. And again, like I said, I put a lot of thought into this. It was kind of like a fun thought exercise, but the gloves, the pants, and the jacket, and the logic basically remains sound. Is, I love my brain, I love my spine, I love being able to walk. I feel like, if the worst thing were to happen, I was unprotected in other areas, like I'll get the most out of this, right? And while kind of we as humans can decide whether or not to get on or off that motorcycle, businesses are going to try and grow. Businesses are going to try and sell. Businesses are going to try and build. So it's not really a question of, well, just don't run the business. The business is going to run, right? We have to secure the business. And that's why this is, I hope, a relevant and a relevant illustrative example of asset risk, using the rider as the analogy. So at the end of the day, the risk context of the rider absolutely needs to be considered, right? Similarly, so not every IT asset or technology asset has that same risk profile, right? We've got a bunch of assets these days. We got your IT assets, your data centers, your Internet of Things, your cloud assets, your workloads, your applications, your Kubernetes clusters, your infrastructure as code scripts. Just it's even existential almost of like what is an asset, right? And so some risk factors to consider regarding the systems themselves. So this has nothing to do with the vulnerabilities. Is just, well, how important is it to the business? Now, does this asset belong into a group that is part of your flagship product line? Or is it an asset that's tied to some skunkworks project, right? These are good questions to ask, and just as security folks, it makes us more able to sell security into the business to these non-security stakeholders, right? Similarly, or conversely, there's a bunch of regulations out there. So sometimes the risk is maybe more financially motivated. There's an actual fine that you would receive if something is not compliant with regulations, right? So is the asset itself subjected to HIPAA or PCI or other regulations? And again, my point here isn't to kind of tell you what to do, is to help you understand how to think, and how to think in a way that ultimately help you communicate to stakeholders, right? To get buy-in. And these are relatively simple thoughts, right? So does the database, for example, or does the application, does it store or process personally identifiable information versus not? Like, what kind of information is it using? What industry are you in, right? In financial services or in consumer goods? These things matter as far as kind of the context and the environment of the vulnerabilities themselves. And a big obvious one is it internet facing, right? There's a lot of debate on with zero trust and everything going on right now, that it doesn't really matter if it's interfacing or not. You should always just assume that someone can access it. But still, if you're trying to prioritize a list of 10 million vulnerabilities, which is a scale that Brinqa does see for large enterprises, it's not unheard of. You need contextual risk factors to include to help everyone understand kind of why you're doing something, why it's a priority, and oftentimes why it's not a priority. So without context, you'll never know you'll never know your real risk. That's the point here. We were saying before, is like, it's just not actionable to say, yes, it's risky, or no, it's not. There's not enough resources in the world to go tackle everything that's risky, let alone the fact that it's subjective. So this helps make it a little bit more objective, more actionable. And so we're going to switch now over to the vulnerability side of the world. But first, we're going to talk about the motorcycle itself. So not every motorcycle has the same risk profile as every other motorcycle out there. Thanks to my good friends at Geico for writing this blog, making it easy. I was trying to research, like, what are the different things that would reduce the risk to me as a rider, right? Because my motorcycle is, safer. So anti-lock braking systems, they've been in cars for forever. They're actually a relatively new thing in motorcycles. If I had ABS versus not having ABS, that'd be one way in which the motorcycle itself, the risk context would change. What about adaptive headlights? Well, this one's interesting because I would say if you always ride, in sunny days in the afternoon, then probably makes no difference the fact that you have adaptive headlights, because your personal context is going to make that a moot point. But you're riding at dusk, dawn, night, just kind of stormy weather, I'd say this absolutely would lower your risk, right? You get credit for that. So this is how deep that kind of rabbit hole goes. Tires are probably one of the biggest causes of accidents, I think, is in motor vehicles. So getting electronic tire pressure monitors just to make sure, you only have 2, you don't have 4, right? On your motorcycle is a big boon to safety, kind of to making sure at least you're notified if they're under or overinflated. They make motorcycles that could automatically shift for you. You can actually communicate vehicle to vehicle a little bit now. So these are just all sorts of ways that what my point is, that not every motorcycle has the same kind of, residual risk. So the risk context of the bike absolutely has to be considered. Now, not every vulnerability either has the same risk, right? So they might have the same CVSS score, but they don't have the same risk. So you see here is just a screenshot from CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities list. But just to run through a few different risk factors to consider regarding vulnerabilities, one of the big question is, has the vulnerability ever actually been exploited? And so there's a lot of, I'd say potential for debate here on how much that matters or doesn't matter. But I'd kind of say that is a very good question to ask and a very good fact to know when prioritizing. So if something has actually been exploited before, for me personally, yes, that would increase its priority level in my mind than something that has never actually been exploited, at least that we know about, right? Also, a lot of companies today have threat intelligence feeds. Your recorded futures, your Mandiants, your so on and so forth, both commercial and open source. There's too much going on to ad hoc kind of correlate the threat intelligence feed with all the vulnerabilities you have. So you really want some way to automate the correlation between what vulnerabilities you have and then kind of what your threat intelligence feeds are telling you. But again, if your threat intelligence feed is telling you, hey, it's a low risk or high risk, that's something to consider in regards to the vulnerability that you have yourself. Also, on the other side, it's not just about kind of making it more risky, right? It's like, is it less risky? So what are some examples of compensating controls? Like network segmentation or multi-factor authentication. Do you already have some sort of mitigating or compensating control in place? And I know there's a lot of buzz around SBOM, software bill of materials. And so the detractors that I hear talking about that, this is one of their big problems, because they're saying, hey, you're gonna ask me to tell everyone else about kind of, what risks I have, but, within the concept of the ingredients list, that is the SBOM, it's impossible or hard or difficult for anyone else to understand why that's not actually a risk for me, right? So these are some of the more mature organizations, how they're thinking about it, right? So we want to be watchful of that. So the point here is that CVSS alone is absolutely not enough to score the actual risk rating. You have to personalize it to you, to your business, to your environment, to your context for effective risk scoring. All right. And I promised everybody we'd do a meme break. So I'll pause and let you digest this one to see how risk scores can look very, very different, with and without business context. All right. I think I've given you enough time. All right. So we got kind of two more, back and forth analogies and we'll wrap up. But sometimes, motorcycles are used to race on tracks. My point here is that some people ride, I guess, just to ride. Some people ride for a reason. They want to go really fast, right? They want to race. And so similarly, right? Security teams like to follow a process, like actually trying to do something. You're not just kind of sitting back thinking, is this risky? I really want to get to the 100th decimal place on a risk score to know just how risky it is, just for the sake of knowing and not doing anything about. It's not a thing that happens, right? Like, we're doing this to actually reduce the risk, and just finding it, just scoring it, it doesn't reduce the risk. You actually have to remediate the risk, address the risk, or accept the risk, right? So you might know this process by a different name. At Brinqa, we call it the cyber risk life cycle. You might know it's kind of like the vulnerability remediation life cycle, or the vulnerability management life cycle, or something like that. It's all relatively similar. Essentially, you kind of inventory all your assets and their vulnerabilities. You prioritize that risk. You remediate it, and then you report on it. You go over and over and over. You do this across your different security programs. The catch here, though, is, while this makes sense, while people know this, when you actually kind of look at what folks are doing, it's often very siloed. So in the worst cases, it's siloed to maybe just a specific scanning tool. Let's say my SAST scans within a specific security program. Let's say my application security program within my organization, right? So the problem with that is, yes, I'm inventorying all my kind of SAST findings, and I am trying to prioritize those findings and kind of run through the process. But how much context am I missing out on? How much context am I missing out on by not including a holistic view of the world, right? You hear a lot about the shift left, and it's kind of belabor the buzzword, but a lot of those security issues show up later in the cloud. So wouldn't it be better to know, when you're prioritizing your SAST scans, the security posture of your cloud, that sort of thing. So my point is that there's a relationship here. And it's kind of nuanced too, because the scanners don't know what they don't know about, like at an individual level. But if you take a holistic view, you can start essentially kind of piecing together a better asset inventory, because all your different scanners are showing different assets that exist, and kind of organizing that could help you then understand, well, what assets do I have that are not being scanned, which is a pretty difficult question to answer quickly, right? On top of that, if we just have missing pieces, fragmented view of the world, missing context, there's a practical side of just basic security practices. Like, do I want to implement role-based access controls on my scanning systems? And it's like, well, does it really make sense to do the same thing, a dozen times across a dozen different tools? Or does it make more sense to have a more unified, place to protect, right? And so, there'll be different opinions on that, of course. But, to help you scale, it absolutely would make sense to have a little bit more of a unified view of that world. And once you have that holistic context, you get just better, smarter personalization, because you can integrate context from your CMDBs, for example, your business context. You have one place to go into and then correlate across all these different findings. And that matters, because if you actually get the prioritization wrong, things start to happen that aren't great. So let's take our 9.0 CVE. So I think that's typically on the bottom end of critical, right? If we didn't do anything and just threw it across the line as a 9.0 as a critical, it'd be a certain SLA, a critical SLA often that gets tied to that. But then it starts potentially eroding trust with your remediation owners, because they might see that and say, hey, this is a sandbox environment. Why are we wasting our time with this? It's not even connected to anything. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's not true. But the point is, it's eroding trust. And so time spent remediating is now time spent discussing, if they're working on the right thing. And then reporting that, It's like, what's the point in a report on remediation progress? I'm not even remediating the things that matter most to my business, right? Conversely, let's take like a lower risk CV, like something that's like a 7.0, critical product line, processes personally identifiable information, needs to be PCI compliant, doesn't have mitigating controls tied to it, has been exploited before, so on and so forth. So that's actually, let's just say, a 9 to 10 range. So do you really want to kind of peg that as a low to medium, kind of take longer for it to be remediated? No, you want to prioritize it appropriately. But then when you do that, you really want to have that process documented so someone could understand. They don't think you're kind of sandbagging to get something done faster, right? And ultimately, those reports at the end of the day, whether it's to other security folks, to your non-security stakeholders, to leadership, to board, to CISO, to CEO, as they're getting more involved, you really want to kind of have your house in order for those reports, or they're just really just pretty pictures at the end of the day, right? So there's ways you could do this, and just to talk about it on the motorcycle side real quick, I want to kind of give this analogy. There's obviously different ways to solve the problem, right? I'm dubbing this motorcycle risk management, trademark, pending. But there's the idea of proactive and reactive, right? So I'm going to start from right to left on this slide. So reactive would be, I'm not going to worry about protecting myself until I need to worry about protecting myself. So I'm going to rely on airbag clothing to respond to the, imminent threat of a collision because I was in an accident. And yes, for those of you that don't know, for those of you that don't know, this is a real thing, right? So one of the modern safety technologies in motorcycles is that the clothing I actually wear can kind of detect collision and automatically inflate like on impact. So very kind of similar to the concept of car airbags, right? Conversely, you could practice really good driving habits. You could obey your traffic laws. You could, wear more safety gear. You can maintain your bike, right? And in security, this concept's more or less known as hygiene or security posture, right? The idea is it's, I personally would not like to wait for the imminent threat of a collision and then hope that everything works out at that time. I'm more of a proactive kind of guy. So I'll, practice my good driving habits. I'll assume cars don't see me, that sort of thing, right? To hopefully never need to rely on the airbag clothing, but I would have, right? The airbag clothing as well. It's better to be, double covered here if you can. And so I want to throw a concept at you, and I promise these aren't just new words because I'm on a marketing team. I'll explain to you why I think these new words are appropriate and beneficial, right? So traditionally in security, some of you might hear this say, hey, it sounds similar to a SOC, unifying, you're talking about unifying all this data. The thing is that the SOC, the Security Operations Center, are usually, focused more on the post-attack side of the world. I mean, you got all your different security scanning tools across, your data centers, your cloud, your workloads, your applications, your users, sending indicators of compromise. And this is where like words really matter. And so they're detecting threats, helping you respond to those threats. But on the other side of the world, like we just talked about with the motorcycle, there's a whole pre-attack world, right? Where these same tools are providing you indicators of exposure. It's not a compromise yet, but it could be, right? And we want to, prioritize those vulnerabilities and mitigate those risks, address those risks proactively, to essentially reduce the reliance on kind of, last minute Hail Mary type plays. So at Brinqa, we call this a risk operations center. This is kind of a combination of kind of people, process, and technology, just to be clear. But I want to kind of touch on why we're kind of naming it risk operations center, aside from like the cleverness of it, playing well with the SOC. It's also, we ran this through some of our customers. Hey, it's kind of what they're doing. They're not calling it that, but essentially a centralized or unified vulnerability management program, right? The problem that we at Brinqa have with the word vulnerability is that it too often feels narrow. It kind of implies a CVE, which is like an older view of the world, because today risks aren't just the CVEs. Like you have You have misconfigs, your CSPM, your cloud security posture management scanners are finding cloud misconfigurations. You have issues in code where developers are hard coding, secrets in plain text, right? There's no CVEs tied to that stuff. They're just risks. So at Brinqa, we call these security findings, by the way, but because they're risk is a bigger, more powerful word, more appropriate word, we think. So thus Risk Operations Center. Absolutely would love any feedback that you all have. Just, find me on LinkedIn, email me, send it my way. And so far we had a lot of good response to this concept. But let's kind of wrap up though, right? Why do we do this? What's the point of doing this? Why does context matter? Not just theoretically, oh, that's cool. Yeah, that makes sense. But what does it do for the business? Well, it enhances efficiency, reduces risk. There's less business interruption. There's increased credibility, security with their, remediation owner stakeholders that they rely on, and just better informed decision making. So, I want to call back to a story that I heard from a customer, where they were in a spot where they kind of looked themselves in the mirror and said, we can't genuinely and honestly and authentically say that we know, or that we even feel that we're spending our remediation time or remediation capacity reducing the risks that matter the most to the business. What can we do about that? And so they put in a lot of effort. They did use Brinqa, but they themselves put in a lot of effort as well to kind of build the team around it and the process around it to operationalize a lot of the concepts that I'm speaking about with you today. All right, so that's my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope at minimum that you've got some powerful analogies to kind of help tell your VP of whatever business line why security matters and help them understand it, right? I also hope that you understand that risk is subjective. Because of that, we really need to do a good job, not just contextualizing this risk, but I want to emphasize making, documenting or showing our work in a way that others can follow along. Just reduce that burden. So said a different way, you don't want to take all that you learned today, put it in sort of a black box, and then throw it over the fence and expect someone else to understand it, right? You want to help build those champions by documenting, hey, yeah, it's a low by default from a risk perspective, but it's a high because of these things. We want to kind of just think culturally in this way. So if you liked what you heard today, just visit Brinqa.com. QR code will take you right there to learn more. And again, I'm Alex Barr. It was great presenting to you all today. Thanks.